My name is Sadie Robertson. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been deeply entrenched in the world of luxury hospitality. Right now, I manage a prestigious hotel chain that spans several cities, a world where polished marble lobbies and impeccable service are more than just features. They're expectations woven into every guest's experience. Every day, I balance the demands of running these elite properties, navigating crises, and maintaining the brand's sterling reputation. It's a fast-paced, high-pressure environment where every detail matters, and reliability isn't just appreciated, it's mandatory. But despite the intensity of my professional life, I've always made family a priority. No matter how exhausted I am after a day full of meetings and operational headaches, I've never wanted to be the kind of daughter who disappears during the holidays or skips those moments that matter. I've worked hard to sustain connections with my family, especially around Christmas, when everyone seems to gather and the world feels a little softer, even if just for a moment. It's the one time each year I'd hoped we could all come together and put aside any tensions or unspoken grudges. This Christmas was supposed to be no different. I had plans. I imagined the house filled with laughter, the scent of pine and cinnamon wafting through the rooms, the clinking of glasses and the warmth of familiar faces. I thought about the years I'd spent cooking meals alongside my mother, Margaret, the careful folding of napkins, the meticulous setting of the table, all those quiet demonstrations of care that, to me, said, "You belong here." My husband Ethan and I had cleared our schedules. We'd even booked flights early, knowing how quickly the holiday season fills up. I was ready to step into the family tradition and carve out a place for my own children alongside my parents and brother. Then came the moment that shattered all that hope. I remember it clearly. A brief phone call from my mother, Margaret. Her voice was clipped, and there was a smirk I seemed to catch even over the line. "No room for you at Christmas," she said, like it was a fact of life rather than a choice. No explanation, no softening, just a dismissive statement that landed like a cold gust in the middle of December. I blinked, stunned, as if the words echoed louder than I expected. I wanted to ask why, to plead for inclusion, but something inside me held back. Instead, I masked my hurt with a calm, practiced tone. "I understand," I said quietly, forcing myself not to sound upset. But I knew this wasn't just a scheduling conflict or a sudden change of plans. The message was clear. I was being excluded, deliberately, and beneath that exclusion lay a deeper truth, something I had sensed for years but had buried under layers of hope and effort. That was the moment I realized this Christmas would be different, colder, emptier, and far more complicated than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about missing a holiday dinner. It was about being sidelined by the very people I had tried to love and support, by the family I'd devoted so much to. And though I held the phone tightly in my hand, I knew the story was far from over. This was just the opening act of a much longer, darker chapter. The pattern of exclusion and favoritism didn't start overnight. It had been simmering beneath the surface for as long as I could remember. Years of subtle slights and overt messages that I was somehow less than the golden child of the family. My younger brother, Lucas. Mom's favoritism was never a secret. It was like a slow drip of cold water, persistent and numbing, shaping every interaction in ways I resisted seeing at first. I recall one Christmas years ago when I was still in my early 20s, fresh out of college, eager to step into adulthood with a sense of belonging. I had spent days preparing a feast for the family, roasting the turkey until the skin was perfectly crisp, baking pies with precise swirls of meringue, and setting the table with the fine china that belonged to my grandmother. I remember the smell of cinnamon and cloves in the air, the warmth of the kitchen, and my hope that maybe, just this once, my efforts would finally be noticed, not as background noise, but as the centerpiece they deserved to be. Instead, as everyone gathered, my place at the table was shoved to the far end, a conspicuous afterthought. Lucas, sparkling with confidence and the effortless charm Mom so adored, sat in the seat of honor, right next to her. She lavished him with compliments about his latest business venture, a new tech startup she hyped as the future of the family legacy. Meanwhile, my quiet achievements, the internship I'd secured in a competitive hospitality firm, The promotions I'd fought for were met with polite nods or, worse, ignored as if they were insignificant. The gifts only underscored the divide. Lucas received the expensive gadgets, designer clothes, and that sleek sports car lease that made the neighbors talk. I got a thoughtful scarf, a book I'd never asked for, tokens that screamed afterthought rather than celebrated daughter. Every year, the pattern repeated like clockwork. Lucas basking in the glow of praise and extravagant generosity, me shrinking quietly into the background, my contributions invisible. Mom's favoritism wasn't just material, it was the way she spoke to us too. To Lucas, she was warm, encouraging, sometimes even doting. To me, her words often carried an edge of impatience or disappointment, as if I was perpetually falling short of some invisible standard. Once, when I suggested a new idea for the family charity event, something I'd spent weeks planning, she dismissed it with a smirk and said, "Maybe you should stick to your day job, Sadie. Leave the big decisions to Lucas." The room had gone silent, the sting of her words magnified by the presence of relatives who looked at me with a mix of pity and awkwardness. Over time, I began to internalize these moments, telling myself it was just how families were, that favoritism was a generational quirk, a protective shield for the golden child. I convinced myself that maybe Mom was trying to preserve Lucas's confidence, that my role was to support in the background, to be the steady, reliable one who held the pieces together while the spotlight shone elsewhere. I rationalized that my sacrifices mattered in a quiet way, that they were the glue keeping us all connected, even if unacknowledged. But those quiet sacrifices, cooking meals, managing family logistics, smoothing over conflicts, never earned me a seat at the table where it counted. Every past Christmas served as a painful reminder. No matter how much I tried, I was always an outsider in my own family's narrative. The table where we gathered to celebrate wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of acceptance, and I was always on the wrong side of it. Looking back, I see now how those years shaped me, the mix of hope and hurt, love and alienation. The pattern was clear. Lucas was the heir, the favored one, the shining star in Mom's eyes, and I was left to wonder if, despite all my efforts, there would ever be a place for me, not just at the Christmas table, but in the family's heart. My dedication to my family extended far beyond just showing up during the holidays or cooking elaborate meals. I wasn't simply the sister who brought a dish to the table. I was the quiet backbone supporting them through crises they barely acknowledged. When Dad's health took a frightening turn a few years ago, his heart condition forcing him into a sudden hospital stay, I was the one who stepped up without hesitation. I arranged his medical appointments, handled insurance paperwork, and coordinated care between doctors, specialists, and home nurses. I took time off work to be by his side during those uncertain days, all while keeping my hotel properties running smoothly. The emotional toll was immense, but I didn't complain. My parents had grown used to my steady presence, my willingness to sacrifice time and energy for their well-being. Yet, in the background, I noticed how they rarely expressed genuine gratitude. Instead, there was an expectation, a silent assumption that I would always be there, quietly fixing problems, smoothing out their worries, and keeping the family tethered. I played the role of peacemaker, the one who calmed tensions between Lucas and Dad when business disagreements turned heated. I was the organizer of family gatherings, the planner of birthdays and holidays, arranging venues, coordinating schedules, and even personally handling invitations when others shrugged off the responsibility. During those same years, my own career opportunities often took a back seat to family needs. When an international hotel group approached me to lead their European expansion, a dream role, I hesitated. Dad's health was fragile, and Mom hinted that my presence at home was needed. I deferred the opportunity, convinced that family came first. Ethan understood my choice, though it weighed heavily on both of us. He picked up extra work, stretched his hours at the law firm, and handled more of our household duties while I juggled my demanding job and the emotional labor of caring for my family. Financially, I quietly supported them too. The Hendersons had a reputation to uphold, but beneath the polished veneer, they weren't immune to struggles. When Dad's medical bills piled up, I discreetly transferred funds to cover costs, careful not to make a scene or demand thanks. I paid for repairs on the family estate when the roof leaked during a particularly harsh winter, and even lent money when Lucas's business ventures faltered, despite knowing those loans might never be repaid. I didn't keep a ledger in my mind. I gave because I believed family meant mutual support, even if unbalanced, but none of this seemed to register with them. The sacrifices I made, the late-night calls to doctors, the hours spent planning events, the financial safety nets. I was the invisible scaffold holding the family together, yet I was never invited to share in the recognition or warmth. During gatherings, I was often asked to handle logistics or chase down a missing relative rather than sit and enjoy the celebration. When I suggested ideas for holiday themes or charity drives, they were met with polite nods, but no real enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Lucas basked in the spotlight, praised for his ventures and social accomplishments, shielded from scrutiny by our parents' unwavering favoritism. Ethan was my rock throughout all of this. He never pushed me to confront them directly, but quietly encouraged me to value myself and recognize the imbalance. He reminded me that love isn't only shown in how much you give, but also in how much you are respected and honored in return. His perspective was a lifeline on nights when I doubted my own worth or wondered if my efforts were futile. Despite the neglect and emotional exhaustion, I clung to hope. I believed that maybe, if I kept showing up, kept loving, kept supporting, eventually the family would see me, not just as a dependable helper or a source of financial aid, but as someone worthy of belonging. I dreamed that one day the Christmas table would be truly mine to share, that the scent of pine and laughter would include my children and me in a place of equality and warmth. But hope is fragile, and sometimes it takes shattering to build something new. As I reflect on those years, I realize I gave far more than I was given back, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. The scales were tipped heavily in their favor, and I was left balancing the weight of obligations with little acknowledgement. This realization was a painful seed, but it would soon grow into something stronger, a resolve to protect my worth and set new boundaries, even if it meant standing apart from the family I once longed to fully join. That Christmas, as the cold words from Mom settled in, I understood that my silent sacrifices had not bought me a place at the table. And with that understanding came a shift, a quiet but firm decision that my dedication would no longer come at the cost of my dignity. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The family reunion had been planned for months, a grand affair in the sprawling Henderson estate, the kind of event that drew in cousins, aunts, uncles, and distant relatives from all corners of the country. To outsiders, it was a dazzling display of wealth and unity, silver cutlery gleaming under crystal chandeliers, vintage wines uncorked with ceremonious precision, and laughter echoing through the high-ceilinged rooms. For me, though, it was a minefield, a stage set for subtle power plays and the undeniable tension beneath the surface. That evening, I arrived early, carrying a carefully wrapped bottle of rare champagne I'd sourced from one of our hotel's exclusive vineyards. It was a small gesture of goodwill, a peace offering from a daughter who desperately wanted to be seen, not just as a guest, but as part of the family fabric. The scent of pine garlands mingled with the rich aroma of roasted meats wafting from the kitchen. From the corner of the room, I could see Mom, Margaret, gracefully chatting with her social circle, her laughter light but eyes sharp, always calculating. Dad stood nearby, his posture stiff but his smile practiced, while Lucas floated through the crowd, basking in the glow of his own charisma. When the moment came for me to share my news, I felt a rush of anticipation. After years of hard work, I'd recently been promoted to oversee the opening of a flagship hotel in a major city, a career milestone that should have been cause for celebration. I approached the group gathered near the fireplace, my voice steady but hopeful. I'm thrilled to share that I've accepted the position as regional director for the new Grand Marquis Hotel in Chicago, I announced, carefully watching for their reactions. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without missing a beat, Mom stepped forward, her voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. "Oh, that's nice, Sadie," she said, a smirk curling her lips. "But it's not quite the same as Lucas's latest venture. He's just landed a multi-million-dollar contract with a tech firm. Far more impressive, don't you think?" The words hit me like a sudden chill. The room grew quiet, eyes shifting uncomfortably. Some relatives exchanged polite smiles, unsure where to look, while others seemed to shrink back, sensing the awkwardness that had just settled like a fog. Lucas caught my eye, his expression unreadable but tinged with smug satisfaction. Mom's smirk deepened, as if she had just delivered a perfectly crafted blow. "We all admire Lucas's boldness," she added, her tone almost sing-songy, "while Sadie prefers the safe path of managing hotels. Nothing wrong with that, but it's hardly headline news." I forced a smile, the taste of bitterness sharp on my tongue. My hands clenched briefly at my sides, but I reminded myself, this was family banter, just the usual way things played out in our house. Yet the sting was undeniable. Here I was, standing among people who should have been my biggest supporters, and instead, I was being dismissed, my accomplishments reduced to footnotes against Lucas's glowing narrative. Mom's words weren't just dismissive. They were a subtle public humiliation, a reminder that no matter what I achieved, it would never measure up in her eyes, or the family's. I could feel a heat rising in my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and quiet fury, but I swallowed it down, nodding politely and changing the subject. Later, as the night wore on, I caught snippets of conversations that made the wound feel even deeper. Compliments for Lucas's vision and risk-taking were scattered generously, while my name was spoken with a sort of grudging acknowledgement, as if I was fulfilling some obligatory role. The disparity was as clear as the polished marble floors beneath my feet. Still, despite the humiliation, a small part of me clung to hope. Maybe this was a rough patch, an awkward family moment blown out of proportion. Maybe, just maybe, the holidays would bring a different energy, that shared history and tradition could overcome the unspoken resentments. But as I looked around that room, the glittering chandeliers casting sharp light on familiar faces, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The invisible line that separated me from the rest of the family had been drawn even clearer that night, and I was painfully aware that my place at the table was more precarious than ever. I left the reunion with a hollow ache, the echo of Mom's smirk lingering in my mind like a shadow. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a declaration. I was still the background player in this family drama. And yet, somewhere beneath the hurt, a seed of resolve was planted. This chapter of silent endurance was nearing its end. The warmth I once sought from my family felt colder than ever, but the fire inside me was beginning to burn brighter. The story was unfolding in a way I hadn't anticipated, and the next Christmas was destined to be unlike any before. Christmas Eve had always been a day wrapped in layers of nostalgia and expectation, the flicker of candles casting gentle shadows, the soft murmur of holiday music blending with the crackle of the fireplace, the scent of pine needles mingling with the sweetness of freshly baked cookies. But this year, the familiar warmth felt distant, almost unreachable. The moment I received the call from Margaret, everything shifted. The phone rang late in the afternoon, its sharp tone piercing through the quiet hum of the preparations Ethan and I had been making for our own modest celebration. I answered, expecting the usual check-in or a polite reminder about the evening's plans. Instead, her voice came through cold and clipped, the edges sharpened by a smirk I could almost hear beneath the words. "Sadie," she began, as if she were stating a fact rather than breaking my heart. "There's no room for you or your family at Christmas this year." The words hit me like an unexpected frost. I blinked, the warmth in my chest draining away as the reality settled in. No room. Not just a scheduling conflict or an oversight. No room. It was deliberate, calculated, and unmistakably final. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay steady, to not let the hurt seep into my voice. "I understand," I said softly, biting back the flood of emotions that begged to spill over. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Margaret's voice resumed with an icy finality. "We're keeping the gathering small this year. It's better that way. No apologies, no explanations, just a line drawn in the snow. separating me from the family I had fought so hard to belong to. As I sat there, gripping the phone, a sinking feeling grew heavier inside me. The exclusion was a wound, but it wasn't the only blow that evening had in store. Ethan, who had been in the next room, paused mid-step and glanced toward me, sensing the shift before I even said a word. "I need to tell you something else," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just found out. Lucas has been using the presidential suite privileges at the hotel chain, the ones I manage, without my permission. He booked the entire suite for his own party and they never even asked me." Ethan's eyes darkened with surprise and concern. "That's serious. Were you aware of this beforehand?" "No," I replied, my fingers tightening around the phone. "It wasn't just thoughtless. It was a complete betrayal. It's like they think they can use everything I've built, take whatever they want, and I'll just stand aside." The room felt colder now. I could almost hear the echo of Margaret's earlier smirk reverberating in my mind, the same expression that had belittled me at the reunion months ago. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about control, entitlement, and a complete disregard for boundaries I had silently upheld for years. Ethan came closer, his voice low and steady. "You've been more than patient, Sadie. This isn't just hurtful. It's a breach of trust. You have every right to stand your ground." I nodded, swallowing down the hurt and replacing it with a burgeoning resolve. The years of invisible labor, the financial support, the emotional scaffolding, all of it had been taken for granted, twisted into an assumption that my generosity was infinite. But it wasn't. Not anymore. That night, as the snowflakes drifted silently outside our window, I stared at the phone long after the call ended. The exclusion from Christmas wasn't just a rejection of a single night. It was a declaration that the family I had devoted myself to didn't see me as an equal, as someone worthy of respect or consideration. And Lucas's selfish use of the presidential suite privileges was a blatant reminder of how deeply ingrained their entitlement was. The familiar trappings of the season, the twinkling lights, the wrapped gifts, the carols, all felt hollow now. I realized that this Christmas, I wasn't being left out because of a lack of space or a change in plans. I was being cut off, sidelined in a family drama that had played out for years behind polite smiles and festive gatherings. And yet, beneath the sting of rejection and the ache of betrayal, something else was stirring. A clarity, sharp as the winter air outside, began to take shape. If they thought I would quietly accept this, they were mistaken. If they believed my silence meant consent, they didn't know me at all. That night marked not just the absence of my place at the family table, it marked the beginning of a reckoning. And while the snow fell softly outside, inside I was already planning how to reclaim the respect and dignity I had long been denied. That night, after the phone call ended and the echo of Margaret's cold dismissal lingered in the room, I sat alone in the dim light of our living room. The soft hum of the city beyond the window was distant, muffled as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath along with me. I wrapped a throw blanket tightly around my shoulders, yet the warmth did little to soothe the chill that had settled deep inside my chest. The twinkling holiday lights Ethan had put up earlier cast faint, colorful shadows across the walls, but to me, they only underscored the stark contrast between the festive exterior and the storm raging quietly within. At first, grief washed over me like a heavy tide, an ache so familiar it felt almost routine, yet no less painful. The years of hoping, of trying so hard to earn a place in the family's heart, seemed to unravel in that single moment. Memories flooded back unbidden. Countless hours spent coordinating family dinners, the sacrifices made to cover bills without a word of thanks, the quiet apologies I swallowed when my achievements were met with dismissive remarks or outright comparisons that left me feeling small. I saw the faces of relatives who smiled politely but never truly looked at me, and I heard the tone in Mom's voice, the smirk disguised as civility, each detail carving its way into my mind. But then, as the silence stretched and the initial shock began to dull, something inside me shifted. The grief, heavy as it was, began to harden into something sharper, anger. It wasn't the fiery, explosive kind that burns out quickly. It was a cold, steady fire, fueled by years of invisible labor and unacknowledged devotion. I realized this exclusion was the culmination of a pattern that had been playing out for far too long. The quiet compliance, the endless giving without boundaries, it had only enabled their entitlement. I closed my eyes and replayed the moments when I had been overlooked or diminished. The times I had rearranged my own schedule to accommodate their needs. The nights I stayed up worrying about Dad's health or smoothing over Lucas's reckless decisions. The silent acceptance when my contributions were minimized or erased. It hit me with brutal clarity. They had never truly seen me, not as an equal, not as a daughter deserving of love and respect, but as a resource to be tapped, a safety net to catch their falls without question. In that moment, the fog lifted, the illusions I had clung to, the hope that things might change if I just tried harder, fell away like brittle leaves in a harsh wind. I realized, with a quiet but unyielding certainty, that they would never change. The family dynamics were too entrenched, the favoritism too deeply rooted, and more importantly, I owed them nothing. My worth was not tied to their approval or their version of belonging. The weight of that realization settled over me. Heavy, but liberating. It was like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't noticed I'd been standing in for years. I felt a renewed sense of self, not one defined by sacrifice or quiet endurance, but by dignity and boundaries. The bitterness in my chest was tempered by resolve. This Christmas exclusion was not just a painful rejection, it was a catalyst, a turning point I could no longer ignore. I thought about the future, about what it might look like if I stopped bending to their will, and instead stood firm for myself. The path ahead felt uncertain and a little frightening, but beneath that fear was a growing strength. It was a determination to reclaim respect, to protect my emotional well-being, and to set limits on how much I would allow their entitlement to dictate my life. Ethan's words from earlier echoed softly in my mind, his calm voice a steady anchor. "You have every right to stand your ground." I knew he was right. For so long I had been the family's quiet supporter, the one who bore their burdens without complaint. Now, it was time to shift that balance. Not with anger alone, but with purpose and strategy. I pictured the family's grand estate, the lavish parties, the Christmas table that had so often excluded me. Those symbols of belonging and status suddenly seemed hollow, empty spaces where respect and fairness should have been. I understood that my place there was not something to be begged for or quietly accepted. It had to be earned. But if they refused to earn it themselves, then I would have to redefine what family meant to me. That night stretched on, hours slipping by as snowflakes drifted silently outside the window. The quiet was filled with a swirling storm inside, a mix of sorrow, anger, and a burgeoning hope for something different. I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer be invisible or taken for granted. Turning away from the window, I resolved to face the coming days with a clear mind and a steady heart. The betrayal had cracked open the old narrative, and in that opening, I saw the possibility of reclaiming my power. Whatever came next, I would meet it not as the overlooked daughter, but as a woman who knew her worth and was ready to fight for it. That night, as the city lights blinked softly beyond our living room window and the gentle hum of traffic mingled with the fading echo of holiday music, I knew I had to move past the ache. Grief and anger had settled into a heavy stew inside me, but now it was time to act. Not impulsively, but with precision. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a professional, a strategist, and I had resources they didn't suspect. Ethan sat beside me, his lawyer's mind ticking quietly as he listened to the details I recounted. He was calm, but alert, the kind of presence that steadied me when the world felt like it was unraveling. "They've been exploiting your good nature for years," he said softly, "but that also means they rely on you, and that's your leverage." Leverage. The word felt foreign yet empowering. For so long I'd given without expectation, believing family came first and that love was unconditional. But love doesn't mean erasing your own boundaries or tolerating disrespect disguised as neglect. I felt that truth settled deep in my bones. We started mapping out everything. The Hendersons' dependence on me was more substantial than they realized. The presidential suite privileges they enjoyed at my hotel chain had become a family birthright in their eyes, a perk I'd quietly allowed, a symbol of their entitlement wrapped in my professional world. Lucas's reckless booking of the suite for his own private celebrations, without even a courtesy call, was the last straw. It wasn't just about space or money. It was about control, about who wielded power in this family. Beyond that, there were the financial threads I'd woven quietly over the years. The bills I'd paid to keep the family estate running, the loans extended to Lucas's faltering ventures, the arrangements made during Dad's illness. None of it was documented officially, not in legal terms, but the impact was enormous. My support had been the dam holding back a flood of instability, and without me, that dam would crack. Ethan and I agreed that the first step was to formalize the boundaries with clear actions. I couldn't just react emotionally. I needed to be methodical. So, I picked up the phone the next morning and called Margaret's assistant, Margaret being the gatekeeper of family affairs and social scheduling. My voice was steady, the professional tone I used every day running through my veins. "Margaret, please remove all presidential suite privileges for the Henderson family. Effective immediately. No exceptions." There was a pause on the other end, the sudden catch of breath that told me the message had landed. The privileges were more than perks. They were symbols of status, of legacy, and by removing them, I was severing a thread in the family fabric. Margaret's assistant didn't argue or ask questions. She simply acknowledged and said she'd update the system. Next, I began compiling records, emails, invoices, financial statements, all the pieces that quietly told the story of my years of support. I wasn't doing this to shame or humiliate. I was preparing a dossier, a shield, a way to protect myself if things spiraled. It was a way to prove that my goodwill had limits and that the family's entitlement had been costing me dearly. Throughout these days, Ethan was my sounding board, reminding me to stay calm and focused. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about reclaiming respect. You're setting terms for how you expect to be treated going forward." I nodded, absorbing the weight of that. For so long, my efforts had been erased or minimized, dismissed as expected. Now, I was flipping the script. I had the power to enforce consequences and to reshape the narrative. The Hendersons thought they could use me like a resource, but they hadn't counted on me becoming a strategist. I also walked the halls of the hotels I managed with fresh eyes, seeing how the policies and privileges I'd allowed informally could be adjusted formally, without disrupting the brand's reputation. I coordinated with the concierge and reservations teams to flag any Henderson family bookings for review, ensuring no special exceptions would slip through unnoticed. The luxury and exclusivity that defined the chain now had boundaries, and the family's entitlement was no longer an untouchable given. Behind the calm professionalism, my heart beat with a mix of sorrow and resolve. This was not a moment of triumph, but a turning point. A declaration that my generosity had limits, my patience had an end, and my dignity was non-negotiable. I was no longer the quiet scaffolding holding the family's crumbling walls. I was the architect of new boundaries. Late one evening, as I reviewed the last spreadsheet of transactions, Ethan squeezed my hand. "They've underestimated you for too long," he said softly. "Now, they'll have to see what standing up looks like." I swallowed hard. The future uncertain, but the path now clear. The next steps would require strength and patience, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to claim my place, not just in my family's world, but in my own. This was the beginning of a new chapter, written on my terms. The days following that shattering Christmas Eve call felt like stepping into a quiet war zone, tense, deliberate, and charged with purpose. I knew the family expected me to react with hurt or desperation, to beg for a place at their table, or plead for the privileges they took for granted. Instead, I chose silence, the calm before the storm. I began a subtle withdrawal, not loud or confrontational, but firm and unmistakable. The first change was in how I answered the phone. Calls from Mom, Lucas, even distant relatives were met with polite but prompt responses. Where I used to linger, hoping to soften tensions or keep the peace, now I kept conversations brief and businesslike. "I'm a bit tied up right now. I'll get back to you," I'd say, then follow through by not calling back until days later, if at all. The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but it set a boundary, a message that I was no longer the family's ever-available problem solver. Financial support, once given quietly and without question, began to dwindle. I stopped sending birthday gifts to cousins I hardly saw and declined requests for loans or help with unexpected expenses. My bank statements, once a ledger of generosity, became a record of restraint. Ethan noticed the change, of course. He watched as I tightened the reins around what had become a one-sided flow of resources, but his steady presence reminded me this wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming what was mine. I also ceased organizing family events. Previously, I had been the one coordinating venues, sending out invitations, and managing the endless logistics that made gatherings possible. Now, the invitations simply didn't go out from me. When family members asked about upcoming celebrations, I gave vague answers or suggested they speak with Mom or Lucas. The absence of my usual involvement was a quiet but powerful statement. Without my efforts, the family's smooth operation began to wobble, though they tried to pretend everything was fine. Meanwhile, at work, I moved swiftly to formalize the changes I'd begun behind the scenes. The hotel chain's policies, once flexible enough to accommodate the Henderson family's informal presidential suite privileges, were tightened without fanfare. I convened discreet meetings with the concierge team, the reservations department, and the guest services managers. Effective immediately, I instructed. No exceptions for the Henderson family, unless pre-approved through official channels. I watched their faces, sensing a mix of surprise and curiosity. These privileges were long-standing, and revoking them would ripple through the family's social circles. I also set up alerts in the booking system to flag any Henderson-related reservations, ensuring they would be scrutinized for misuse or unauthorized access. The luxury and exclusivity that defined our brand had to be preserved, and no one, not even my family, was above the rules. The policies weren't punitive. They were professional boundaries, a line drawn in the sand. I had to remind myself that this was about respect and fairness, not revenge. At home, the contrast between my professional composure and the emotional undercurrent was stark. I kept my face calm, my voice measured, and my schedule full. But inside, each decision to withhold, to say no, to stand apart, was a small victory. Yet I also felt a pang of sorrow, a mourning for the family I once hoped to hold close, for the warmth I sought but was denied. The holiday decorations Ethan insisted on putting up around the house felt bittersweet reminders of traditions that no longer included all of us. Throughout this phase, Ethan was my anchor. He helped me draft clear communications for the hotel staff, reviewed legal documents to ensure my personal assets and business interests were protected, and quietly reminded me to pace myself. "This isn't just about cutting them off," he said. "It's about building a foundation where you can stand tall without being pulled under." His unwavering support gave me strength on days when the loneliness crept in. The family noticed the shifts, of course. Calls grew less frequent, invitations were less insistent, and rumors started to circulate among our social circles. But instead of confrontation, there was denial. Margaret brushed off the changes as Sadie's busy schedule. Lucas shrugged and redirected attention elsewhere, and Dad stayed silent, caught between loyalty and discomfort. None of them knew the full extent of the boundaries I was setting, or the strategy I was quietly unfolding. On a few occasions, I saw glimpses of their confusion, and perhaps a flicker of panic when reservations they expected were denied, or when their usual calls went unanswered, but I remained composed. My tone never wavered from professional courtesy, my actions measured and deliberate. This was no longer about being the accommodating daughter. It was about being the architect of my own life, where respect was the currency and boundaries were the rules. As the days turned into weeks, the subtle withdrawal deepened. I was no longer the invisible backbone holding the family's world together. Instead, I became a presence defined by limits they hadn't anticipated and couldn't easily ignore. And while the path ahead was still uncertain, for the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet sense of power settling in, a power born of clarity, dignity, and the courage to say enough. New Year's Eve carried its usual mix of glittering anticipation and quiet reflection, but for me, it was the moment to draw a line that had long needed to be etched in stone. The festive bustle outside our window, the soft glow of street lamps reflecting on ice, faint carols drifting through the cold night air, stood in stark contrast to the weight pressing down on my chest. I had rehearsed the words over and over, but the finality of what I was about to say still came with a pang of bittersweet resolve. I sat at my desk, the soft hum of the city blending with the faint clinking of glass from nearby celebrations. My phone was in hand, my fingers steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. I dialed Margaret's number, the call ringing sharply through the quiet room until she answered with a voice that was all polished civility. "Margaret," I began, letting my tone carry the firmness that the situation demanded. "I'm calling to inform you that the Henderson family's presidential suite privileges have been revoked, effective immediately and indefinitely." There was a pause on the other end, a subtle hitch in her usually unflappable voice. I imagined the smirk she'd worn so often fading, replaced by a flicker of surprise or perhaps disbelief. "Effective immediately?" she echoed, the words tasting foreign, like they were struggling to find purchase in her carefully curated world. "Yes," I confirmed, my voice calm but resolute. "The privileges were granted as a courtesy, but recent actions, specifically Lucas's unauthorized booking of the suite without my knowledge or approval, make it clear that those courtesies have been abused. This is a professional decision, and it reflects the standards of the hotel chain I manage." Margaret's tone tightened, a subtle edge creeping in. "Sadie, this is family. There must be some misunderstanding." "I'm aware of the family connection," I interrupted gently but firmly. "However, my role as regional director obligates me to uphold the integrity of our brand and the fairness of our policies. Privileges like the presidential suite are not entitlements. They are earned and must be respected. This is not negotiable." I could hear her inhale sharply, composing herself as if rehearsing a response that would mask her frustration, but I held fast. The years of unseen labor, the silent endurance of condescension, and the blatant disregard for boundaries had led me here. My voice didn't waver as I added, "Additionally, I have instructed our reservations team to cancel all pending and future bookings under the Henderson name that rely on these privileges. Any further attempts to circumvent these policies will be treated as violations of our terms." There was a brief silence where only the distant sounds of celebration filled the void. Then Margaret's voice softened, a trace of vulnerability breaking through the facade. "Sadie, have you thought about what this means? The family's reputation, our gatherings?" "I have," I said firmly, "and the family's reputation has relied too heavily on borrowed support for far too long. Many of the luxuries and conveniences you've come to expect were funded or facilitated through the hotel chain's goodwill, support you never acknowledged. It's time for accountability." That last statement hung heavily between us, an unspoken ledger of debts paid and dignity ignored. The silence that followed carried the gravity of years of entitlement colliding with the reality of consequence. When Margaret finally spoke again, her voice was quieter but edged with a mix of defiance and a plea for understanding. "This will cause ripples, Sadie. You're aware of the social circles we move in. This is no small matter." "I'm fully aware," I replied, steeling myself against the coming storm. "But respect and fairness should never be sacrificed for appearances. This is about defining boundaries and ensuring that respect is mutual. If the family wishes to rebuild trust, it will have to start with recognizing those boundaries." The call ended soon after, leaving a heavy stillness in the room. I exhaled slowly, the breath carrying a mixture of relief and sorrow. The revocation of the presidential suite privileges was more than a policy change. It was a declaration that the era of unquestioned entitlement was over. In the hours that followed, messages began trickling in, some from loyal hotel staff confirming the cancellations, others from acquaintances within social circles buzzing with whispered speculations. The ripple I anticipated was forming, and I was at its center, calm and unyielding. Richard's pale face during a brief encounter days later told me the truth of the impact, even before words were exchanged. The fortress of entitlement that had shielded the Henderson family was cracking, and I was no longer willing to prop it up with my silence or my resources. I knew this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be difficult, layered with confrontations and challenging conversations. But for the first time in years, I felt a quiet power in standing firm, not as the obedient daughter or the invisible supporter, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity and demanding the respect she deserved. The night deepened, and the city's celebrations swirled beyond my windows. But inside, a new story was beginning, one where I was no longer invisible, and where boundaries were not just drawn, but enforced. The days after I delivered the news about the revocation of the family's presidential suite privileges were charged with a tension I hadn't fully anticipated. I stayed deliberate and measured, but I could sense the tremors of panic radiating through the Henderson family. Word travels fast in our circles, and once the first cancellations went through, it was only a matter of time before the ripple became a wave. It wasn't long before the Hendersons were scrambling. Invitations were sent out for upcoming social events, galas, charity fundraisers, even the annual Henderson Estate Summer Garden Party, and all their usual requests for luxury accommodations suddenly hit dead ends. Hotels that once rolled out the red carpet for them now treated their booking inquiries like any other guests, with no special privileges to smooth their path. For a family so accustomed to entitlement, every rejection was a small but significant humiliation. Margaret's calls began almost immediately. I could hear the edge in her voice, a mix of desperation, frustration, and a faint attempt at coaxing. "Sadie, darling," she would start, her tone syrupy but tense. "This has gone far enough. Surely you can make an exception. Just for the sake of the family? It's Christmas after all." But I kept my replies calm, careful not to let the door crack open. "I'm sorry, Margaret. This decision is final and necessary. I hope you understand." Sometimes her words shifted, veering into thinly veiled threats disguised as concern. "You don't want to see what this will do to the family's reputation, do you? Think carefully before you burn bridges." Those moments were tougher, because beneath the veneer of manipulation was a woman who once was my mother, and who still held sway over so much of our shared history. But I remained firm. Respect and fairness are not negotiable. If the family wants to rebuild trust, it will have to start with recognizing boundaries. Lucas's reaction was more volatile and volatile. The golden child, who had so often been shielded from consequences, now faced the stark reality of lost privileges. His usual confidence wavered when his party plans collapsed, when he had to suddenly find new venues, new hotels, and pay out of pocket for accommodations and events he'd always expected to be covered or discounted. I heard through the grapevine that his social standing took a hit. The whispers started about the family's fall from grace, about how they were no longer the untouchable Hendersons who could command exclusive treatment everywhere. It was a slow unraveling. Financial pressures that had been quietly masked by my support began to surface. The family estate, with its grandeur and history, suddenly faced overdue maintenance bills and mounting expenses. Without my discreet financial cushions, cracks appeared, both literal and figurative. Staff who had once been paid off quietly began to voice concerns. Contractors started calling with increasingly urgent invoices, and the family's glossy public image started to lose its polish. Relatives who had long admired the Henderson name began to question the foundation beneath it. Some expressed regret in private conversations, lamenting that they had unknowingly enabled a toxic dynamic. "It's heartbreaking to see how much Sadie has given and how little she's been recognized," one cousin confided to me during a chance meeting. There was sympathy, but also a clear recognition that the family's dysfunction had been allowed to fester unchecked for years. Margaret, sensing the growing instability, tried to rally others to her side. She painted herself as the victim in calls and messages, spinning tales of how her daughter was being unreasonable, how family unity was at risk. But many weren't buying it anymore. The narrative was shifting, and for once, I wasn't the one alone in the spotlight. Throughout all of this, I kept my composure. Every interaction, whether a call from a panicked Margaret, a terse message from Lucas, or a questioning inquiry from a relative, was documented and met with professionalism. I refused to be dragged into emotionally charged disputes or rash decisions. This was about setting clear boundaries and enforcing consequences, not about playing family politics. At home, Ethan's steady presence was my anchor. He reminded me to be patient and to protect my own well-being amid the upheaval. "You're doing the right thing," he'd say quietly. "It's hard, but necessary. They have to learn that respect isn't a given. It's earned." The strain on the Henderson family was palpable, but I felt a strange calm. For so long, I had been the invisible pillar holding them up, bearing burdens in silence. Now, by stepping back and drawing lines, I was finally putting my own dignity first. The road ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but for the first time, I was standing on firm ground, no longer the overlooked daughter, but the woman in control of her own story. As the unexpected costs mounted and the family wrestled with their new reality, I sensed the fragile facade of entitlement beginning to crack. And while they scrambled to regain their footing, I remained resolute, ready to face whatever came next with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. The fallout from my decision rippled through the Henderson family with a force I hadn't fully anticipated, though deep down, I knew the consequences would be severe. For years, I had quietly absorbed their dependence, financially, emotionally, socially, patching up their crises, covering debts, and smoothing over the chaos that simmered beneath the polished surface of our family name. Now, with the presidential suite privileges revoked and my subtle withdrawal in motion, the cracks that had long been papered over quickly widened into glaring fractures. The first sign was the estate itself. The grand old house, a stately mansion that had once embodied the Henderson legacy, began to show unmistakable signs of neglect. I had been the unseen hand behind many of its repairs, paying contractors discreetly to fix the leaking roof, the faulty heating system, and the crumbling stonework on its facade. Without my quiet financial support, these expenses went unpaid, and the estate's condition deteriorated rapidly. I received muted whispers from neighbors and family friends, rumors of overdue invoices, contractors threatening to pull out, and urgent calls from the property manager that went unanswered. One afternoon, while reviewing my own business accounts, I noticed a series of foreclosure notices and lien warnings tied to the estate. These weren't rumors or idle gossip. They were legal documents signaling a very real threat. The family's failure to keep up with mortgage payments and property taxes, bills I had long been covering from behind the scenes, had finally caught up with them. The realization hit me hard. The financial safety net I'd woven was unraveling, and the Hendersons were now facing consequences they had long ignored. Meanwhile, their family businesses, which had always been buoyed by unspoken favors and connections I facilitated, began to stumble under increased scrutiny. I had leveraged my professional network subtly over the years, opening doors for them that might otherwise have remained closed. Vendors eased payment terms. Clients extended contracts, partly because of my influence or indirect endorsements. With my involvement receding, these businesses felt the pinch. Contracts were lost, negotiations faltered, and whispers of instability circulated among partners and suppliers. Margaret's response was a mix of calculated theatrics and raw desperation. She launched a campaign of victimhood, portraying herself as the wronged matriarch suffering under the hands of an ungrateful daughter. Her calls and messages to family members and social acquaintances were peppered with pleas for sympathy and thinly veiled warnings. "Sadie's actions threaten to tear this family apart," she claimed, painting a picture of fractured unity and impending ruin. But the tide was turning. Many relatives, long accustomed to the dynamics but weary of the dysfunction, started seeing beyond her facade. In whispered conversations, I caught wind of relatives voicing regret over how things had played out. "Sadie has shouldered so much," one cousin confessed during a brief encounter at a community event. "It's heartbreaking to watch her finally stand up for herself, even if it means the family is unraveling." Others reflected on their own roles, how enabling the Hendersons' entitlement had blinded them to the growing imbalance. The narrative was shifting, and I was no longer the lone voice calling for accountability. Lucas, the golden child, found himself increasingly isolated. His usual charm and confidence, once shielded by Mom's favoritism and my behind-the-scenes support, began to falter. Social whispers about the family's loss of privilege spread quickly in the circles that mattered. Exclusive clubs, business networks, and philanthropic organizations. Invitations to events were delayed or rescinded without explanation. The veneer of invincibility cracked, revealing a vulnerability that unsettled him deeply. I heard through mutual contacts about his growing frustration and desperate attempts to spin the situation, but the damage was done. Throughout all this, I maintained a composed exterior. Each call from Margaret, tinged with manipulation or veiled threats, was met with measured responses. I documented every conversation, every demand, every attempt to pressure me back into the role I was determined to leave behind. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about enforcing boundaries and reclaiming respect. Emotionally charged arguments had no place in these interactions. Instead, I relied on facts, professional detachment, and the quiet strength that comes from finally standing firm. Ethan remained my unwavering support throughout the turmoil. On the toughest days, when the strain of family upheaval threatened to seep into my resolve, he reminded me gently, "Respect isn't something to be given freely when it's abused. You're setting a precedent for how you expect to be treated." His counsel was a steadying force, anchoring me amid the emotional storms and complex dynamics. The financial strain on the Henderson family was not just about money, it was a reckoning. Without the safety net I'd provided, their long-ignored obligations now demanded attention. The estate's looming foreclosure, business instability, and social fallout forced them to confront the reality that privileges without accountability ultimately lead to collapse. It was a painful lesson, but a necessary one. And through it all, I felt a quiet calm growing inside me, a sense of power born not from dominance, but from self-respect and clarity. I was no longer the invisible scaffold holding the family's crumbling world together. I was the architect of new boundaries, setting terms on my own life and dignity. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I was standing on ground I owned, not borrowed, not taken for granted, but earned through strength and resolve. The days that followed the upheaval felt surreal, like walking through a fog that was both disorienting and clarifying. The Henderson family, once so confident in their untouchable status, was now grappling with a reality they hadn't prepared for. The unspoken rules that had governed our relationships, automatic privileges, unquestioned generosity, and silent compliance, were unraveling, thread by thread. And I was at the center of this shift, no longer willing to be the silent enabler. What struck me most was the reluctant acknowledgement that respect and privileges were no longer handed out like heirlooms. I saw it in the way Margaret avoided my gaze during a rare encounter at a social event, in the stiff politeness of Dad's voice when he called, careful not to overstep yet clearly unsettled, even in Lucas's rare text messages, terse and tinged with frustration, lacking the usual confidence I was used to. It was as if the invisible ledger had been balanced for the first time, and the Hendersons were coming to terms with the cost. But it wasn't just about punishment or withdrawal. It was about setting clear, non-negotiable boundaries. I knew that if I didn't define the terms of future interactions, the old patterns might creep back like an unwelcome shadow. So, with a calm clarity that surprised even me, I drafted a letter to the family, outlining my expectations. It wasn't an ultimatum laced with anger, but a firm declaration rooted in self-respect. To move forward, all interactions must be founded on mutual respect and accountability. Disrespect, entitlement, or attempts to circumvent boundaries will result in continued distance. The privileges you once took for granted, be they social, financial, or personal, are no longer guarantees. Engagement will require genuine effort and recognition of these changes. I sent the letter not as a weapon, but as an invitation, an opportunity for them to choose a different path. The silence that followed was heavy, but I sensed it carried the weight of reflection. For once, the family had to reckon with the fact that love and loyalty weren't automatic, that they must be earned and maintained with care. Meanwhile, my focus shifted inward and outward, to my husband, Ethan, whose steadfast support had never wavered, to our children, who deserved a family life marked by dignity and honesty, and to my close friends, the chosen family who had stood by me through years of invisible labor and quiet pain. Their presence was a balm, reminding me that home wasn't just a place or a name. It was where respect lived, There were moments of quiet sorrow, too. A mourning for the family I had hoped for but never fully had. I thought of Christmases past, the empty spaces at the table, the unspoken divides. Yet beneath that sadness was a growing peace, a recognition that I was no longer defined by their approval or rejection. The Hendersons faced a crossroads now. They could cling to the old ways, denial, entitlement, and manipulation, or they could embrace the challenge of genuine growth. I didn't know which path they would choose. What I did know was that I had stepped into a new chapter, one where my worth was clear, my boundaries were firm, and my voice was no longer silent. This wasn't the end of our story. It was a complex beginning, filled with uncertainty and possibility, and as I looked ahead, I felt a quiet strength settling in me, the kind that comes from standing tall in your truth, even when the world around you shifts beneath your feet.